Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for How Hackers Change the Media. I am absolutely delighted to be here with this star-studded panel. Bob McMillan from the Wall Street Journal is here. We also have Lorenzo Franceschi-Bicchierai from TechCrunch. And finally, Sadia, Mirza, who represents victims in the event that they get breached or that there's a cyber extortion event. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a quick moment and telling us a little bit about your background and how you deal with cyber criminals, that would be great.
Sure. I'm Bob McMillan with the Wall Street Journal. So I'm the guy that Sadia never wants to get a call from because there's a breach or something like that. We tend to cover pretty high-profile incidents, and we, sometimes have the distinct experience, shall I say, of interacting with hackers while we're doing that. So I've been writing about cybersecurity for, I'm not even sure anymore how long it's been, 15 years or so. And I started writing in the trades, and now I'm writing for a business publication.
Lorenzo?
I'm a reporter at TechCrunch. Previously, I was at Vice Motherboard for many years. I've been covering hackers and cybersecurity for around 10 years. My first black hat actually was 2013 when Keith Alexander showed up, which was very interesting. I also talk to hackers all the time on what feels like a dozen different chat messaging apps, which is very annoying. Yeah, so every week talk to hackers, try to figure out if they're telling the truth, and reaching out to companies to also try to figure out if they're telling the truth.
I'm excited to be interviewing the reporters. Is this a little nerve-wracking for you that the tables are turned?
This sucks.
Absolutely. It's terrible.
And Sadia, why don't you fill us in on how you end up working with cyber criminals or adjacent to them?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sadia Mirza. I'm a partner at Troutman Pepper, and I lead our incidents and investigations practice. So in my role, I typically am one of the first people that get a call when an organization thinks that they're experiencing a cyber incident. I help them from beginning to end through the response and any kind of follow-up that might come out of it, litigation and investigations. But specifically dealing with cyber criminals as part of the response process, we're often negotiating with cyber criminals through maybe a third-party firm. And then I'm also, relevant to this conversation, very involved with the communication aspect of incident response, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail in a second.
Great, thank you so much. So one thing we've seen as a community that Bob and I were talking about is that cyber extortion in particular has changed, or the way cyber criminals operate. They used to be very stealthy, right? They would lurk in your network, they would steal credit card numbers. Today, they are going to the media. They're threatening the confidentiality of information. They are trying to name and shame their victims, and that's a big change. And so in that process, we see them starting to interact with the media, crave media attention, and attempt to build relationships with journalists. So I just wanted to start off our conversation by showing a couple examples from the dark web. So this is the Black Matter ransomware gang. And they say, we invite journalists and recovery companies for registration on our platform. To register, click Contact Us. And then when they post data, they're threatening to notify the media, as you can see in this one example. So they say, if you do not pay, we will publish that data and inform all the biggest mass media. And in some cases, they even name the media outlets that they're attempting to contact. So I'm curious to know during this conversation, how do you feel about the fact that criminals are trying to manipulate you? And how do you balance the incredibly important public need for information with our need to not empower the criminals? So that's our goal for today.
I'll start then, I guess, because I'm the closest to you. Hackers have pretty much always reveled in the media attention, right? I mean, that's sort of an old thing, but I think what really started to happen kind of around maybe 5 years ago with the ransomware stuff, there were these criminal actors who started having these brands that they needed brand equity, because if you get hit with a ransomware attack and some strange entity asks you to pay them $5 million or whatever, why would you do that? I think there's kind of been this professionalization of the criminal side of hacking that has dovetailed with sort of this long-standing, like, let's get the media's attention as hackers for lulls, essentially. And so they kind of blurred these two things. It was sort of clearer when you had hackers who were just like having fun and just trying to break in for crazy reasons. And now with the professionalization of these ransomware groups, it started getting and extortionists as well. You started getting these situations where they're like very eager for the attention, and they're also completely just awful assholes who are doing it for the money. And balancing that out and figuring out how to interact with them in an ethical way and report on things that our readers need to know, and just not be played has been interesting the last few years.
So Lorenzo, can you take me through your process? First of all, how quickly do you need to publish information? And what's your process for deciding if you're going to listen to, do hackers reach out to you, or do you reach out to them?
A little bit of both. So I don't know. It's hard to tell, whether it's 50% or 20% of the time. But many hackers reach out to us. Sometimes they're like cyber criminals. Sometimes they can also be nation-state hackers. I think we should also remember that, after the DNC hack, for example, the Guccifer 2 hacker was very willing to talk. They were later revealed to be 2 GRU agents, which was very interesting to think about, afterwards. They look for publicity, and we should always keep that in mind. But also, they may have done something that is in the public interest to talk about and to write about. A hospital gets hacked, a school gets hacked, big company gets hacked. There's definitely a public interest in talking about it. But yeah, sometimes they reach out and they are not telling the whole truth, or sometimes they're making it up. In terms of how quickly, I think we try to write a few stories every week. My beat is cybersecurity, and we try to be on top of it. But if we're not sure 100% about something, it's okay. And sometimes other outlets get it, and we're all colleagues in the end. That's fine.
So you don't always publish the hacker's story?
No, we need to verify something. I think just somebody's claim, we only have one source, and it's already a source that's pretty unreliable. You should not trust these people at their face value. Yeah. Okay.
Sadia, any questions you have, or anything you want to add at this point?
I think you guys have touched on a couple of different issues, and just speaking about the brand that you were talking about, I think in our role, the media has always been involved to a certain extent, and when we're responding to security incidents, oftentimes what we get as, what my clients get are threats from the threat actor that we are going to publish if you don't pay. If you don't pay us, we're going to release this to the media. And so that's really where the involvement in media comes from a response perspective, is that lingering threat. And at the end of the day, the threat actors, they're mainly financially motivated. They want to get paid, and they're essentially going to deploy tactics to pressure an organization to pay. And one of the pressures is, okay, we're going to go ahead and release your information to the media. And you were talking about the business brand and reputation, and that alone, we caution against, at least talking to organizations, cautioning against, that alone is not enough of a reason to quickly pay a threat actor. Because truthfully, they might leak it to the media regardless. And so when we see those type of threats, it's just one more factor for us to take into consideration in the decision to pay or not to pay. And also what it tells me, you spoke about the brand and reputation, and I'll tell you, that's really important from a response perspective. The fact that these threat actors have a brand and a reputation is also a factor that comes into play when we're deciding whether or not to pay or not to pay. And so I think from a threat actor's perspective, not only the media is putting pressure, you're putting pressure on an organization to pay, but when you start developing a brand or reputation, I'll say an organization would be more inclined to pay a threat actor group that has a reputation to uphold its commitment. That's a conversation that happens whenever we're talking about paying. And so if it's a brand that's been, that follows through with what they say and they do it, then we're more we're more inclined to pay versus a rogue threat actor that isn't really following the typical playbook of the negotiations and things along those lines. One of the things, Lorenzo, that I think is important, and it's very interesting to me to be able to have this conversation with media, because breaking a story is very different. Like, the objectives for media is different than the objective for victim organizations when it comes to being communications. Whereas you can break a story after you've confirmed a couple of details about an incident. We're not breaking a story. We are trying to get our arms around the full scope of what's happened so that we could provide customers and consumers and regulators with information about the response. And so I think a lot of times victims there's this perception that companies are just trying to hide the ball, right? They're not trying to be transparent. They're not coming out and saying what they know. Truthfully, at the beginning of an incident, you don't know much, right? And so I'm always, even when I'm on the side of one of my clients being impacted by a third-party service provider incident, one of the first things I say is, look, give them some grace, because what you when you force someone to provide information when it's not really ready, is there might be inaccuracies in that. And that brings into, and then if somebody has to go back and change the narrative, that calls into question the credibility of the response. And so I think that that's something important to talk about, is our objectives are different, and why do the media objectives not necessarily line up with what victims are trying to do in their response?
Some companies are better than others.
That's true.
Well, some companies hire Troutman and some don't.
Ooh. So I have a follow-up question for you, Sadia. And this is a safe space, by the way. It's just us. What frustrates you about the media? Since we have this conversation, and don't worry, you'll get your chance next. What frustrates you? What do you want them to know or to do different? Maybe we can make some progress.
Yeah, I think not so much, honestly, it's not so much of a frustration. I think it's the alignment, different objectives, right? And so sometimes if there is a frustration, we'll be in the middle of a response, and then a security researcher will break the story, right? And that does lead to, okay, we've got to pivot. Typically, when I know that it's an incident that could garner some media attention, we've already prepared for that. Like, one of the first things when I get a call is, okay, this is an incident that's likely the media might find out, either because your customers already are going to suspect something, service is down, or you're the type of organization that will get a lot of attention. First thing first is get a communication playbook into place. Figure out who your stakeholders are, what questions that are going to be important to those stakeholders. Your customers are going to have different questions than the regulators, than your consumers, than your employees, than your board. And creating a playbook that is responsive to each stakeholder's questions and concerns is very important. And to do that, don't wait until the security journalist breaks the story. Like, in my mind, that's always a lingering threat for incidents that have certain markers to it, or for certain organizations. And so if there is a frustration, it's just we have to pull out the playbook, but we plan for that. We already know that that's the case, and so it's not so much of a frustration. Maybe sometimes we get follow-up questions from. Sherri, I shared this example. We'll get questions from a reporter that'll say, here's our questions. We're gonna go live at 5 p.m. and it's like 2 p.m. And we need your responses. And oftentimes, again, we're struggling with, we don't have the information and we don't want to misstate anything about the investigation. And so, okay, if you're gonna report and you're gonna go live at 5, I don't want we can't comment or we don't have comments to mean that we're not trying to tell you what's happening. It's just you're asking questions too early in the process, and there is a process to follow.
Got it. All right, Bob, what frustrates you about the victims?
Well, there are two approaches you can take to an incident. One is to just put your head in the sand and hope it'll go away, and the other is to get ahead of it, right? And so I think in a lot of incidents, the approach of just sort of stating the bare minimum and not fully engaging with the press is actually the right thing to do, because most of them do blow over, and there are just so many of them that it's hard to cover. But occasionally there will be an incident where it's like a gushing flow of water running downstream, and the story is going to go somewhere. And if the company is not engaged in a dialogue with us, you just don't know where it's going to go. Like, there's going to be another story. There's great public interest in what's happening. There's going to be a follow-up. It's going to be day 2, day 3 kind of things. And so it's very frustrating when companies are like, well, we put out our one statement and that's it, we're not going to say any more. And then these other things pop up, like the history, like there's historical problems and disgruntled insiders come forward. And the company's just like, we're not going to talk.
Do you think they're better off not talking?
No.
Okay,
but the
why?
thing is,
Why?
if there is...
I feel like you're biased.
Well, I'm self-interested.
Yeah.
So, of course, they should always be talking to the Wall Street Journal. There should be a lot of communication with the Wall Street Journal the entire time. Just write that down, please. But I mean, the story is going to cut the story. So in some of these cases, it is very frustrating because then you see the story evolving, and sometimes it can go in a direction that's not even like accurate. But if somebody pops up and there's sort of an insatiable thirst for more information on this topic, that's going to happen. And so, you know, we're sometimes in a situation where we actually know things that might look better. You know, the company might actually look better if we could report them, and we're trying to get them confirmed, and they're not playing with us. That can be frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of these frustrations. I also understand, you know, the other side, like when somebody reaches out like us and says, you know, we are going live at 5 or in a few hours or tomorrow morning and it's end of the day. You know, I understand that pressure, but sometimes it's because something is already on Twitter, some security researchers are already talking about it. We already have enough evidence to be confident that the data breach is real. You know, sometimes hackers share samples of the hacked data. Not always it's true. You know, if there are phone numbers, for example, emails, we reach out to the victims and say, you know, we're TechCrunch, we're looking into this story, we're not going to name you, we're not trying to, you know, get you in trouble. But is this your data? And if they say yes, then we you know, we're pretty confident if we have like a decent number of people confirming. But yeah, I understand that it's like pressure, but I think from the victim's perspective, the company perspective, but I would like companies to be a little bit more forthcoming. You know, I'm not expecting all details right away. You know, maybe the incident happened yesterday, and I understand that the companies may not know, but maybe there's a middle ground which says, yes, we're investigating an incident, we're aware of it, which happens sometimes, and that's already a good start.
If I could, sorry.
No, ideally there should be follow-ups and answer more specific questions, obviously.
Well, and just one thing, just to tie it into the theme of the panel here, what can happen in these instances is if you're talking to the hackers, then they're going to start, you know, directing the narrative. And as I mentioned previously, this can be very annoying because they are they're not good people. You know, the company is the victim here. They're self-interested, and they often lie to you. So you definitely don't want to be in a situation where some lying criminal is, you know, directing the narrative of your company.
So you feel like the victims could communicate more and it would benefit everybody. And Lorenzo's saying there's a middle ground. Sadia, what do you think? Representing the victims, can we meet in the middle here?
Yeah, we can meet in the middle, but I think there has to be an understanding of what the incident response process looks like. You know, and I'll give you an example from an incident that I did. There's different phases when it comes to incident response. One of the first phases is the forensic investigation, right? And that's when we're trying to figure out how did the bad guy get in, what did the bad guy look at while in the environment, and have we kicked the bad guy out, essentially? So we're trying to answer these questions about the incident itself. Coming out of a forensic investigation, which, you know, sometimes depending on the size of the environment, it could take weeks. Like, we are not going to know root cause the next day. It's typically not the way a forensic investigation unfolds. Sometimes they go a lot faster, but depending on, again, how much collections are taking place and what the evidence that needs to be reviewed, a forensic investigation could take weeks. And, you know, the problem with okay, so once you know forensic investigations, what the forensic firm tells you at the end of a response is, these are the files and these are the folders that were potentially viewed by the bad guy or actually taken by the bad guy. At the end of those weeks, the forensic firm is not saying, oh, here's your list of everyone's information who was impacted, and here's the data that was involved. That is phase 2 of an incident response. So once you know the files and the folders that are potentially impacted, you actually have to, now somebody needs to review those files and those folders to figure out, well, what data is in there? Sometimes for larger incidents, and we did one recently where it was it was a couple of hundred gigabytes of data, but the data itself ended up being scanned PDFs of handwritten spreadsheets from years ago of individuals' names and social security numbers, with the scanned documents being upside down, some of them not really legible. And so we had to bring in, and call recordings. And so you had to bring in a third-party firm to actually manually review those files and folders so that we could provide effective notice under the law.
So you're saying that a lot of victims are not comfortable communicating because they're worried about accuracy, and they don't have all the information they want. Is that right?
Right. It's a process to work towards it.
Right.
So maybe understanding that process and where we're at. But I'll say, there's definitely a middle ground in the terms of, the incident that I'm talking about. When we knew that it was going to take, it literally took months to mine that data. We knew that. We immediately reached out to the regulators and said, hey, we just want you to know that this is the phase that we're at. It's going to take months. We know it's possible, but to know this, and the regulator, and in that incident too, what we ended up doing was putting up a website and saying, listen, here's the phase that we're at. We understand just so everyone knows, it's going to take months to figure out exactly whose data, but if anyone is concerned, please call the call center and sign up for credit monitoring, right? It's providing kind of that mitigating measure in the middle so that everyone, the goal essentially is if there is any consumer harm to get ahead of it. And so we did that.
So I'm curious, Bob, do you think that this is the rationale that all victims have, or do you think there's other reasons why hacked companies may not be communicating with the media? That's a leading question.
Well, I think
that's what we interviewers call it.
I mean, I feel like it often reflects the corporate culture, right? There's some people who are super risk averse, and some people who are kind of willing to take chances. And I think, and Sadia might disagree with me about this, but from my perspective, it feels like some companies are just they're just going to deny, and kind of minimize the window for any kind of future class action suits or complaints or things like that. And some companies will kind of engage in a conversation, and it feels to me like it's sort of a cultural thing. And what's a little bit of a black hole to, I think, reporters is like, whose culture is driving this? Like, is it the legal team? Is it the CEO? Is it the CISO? Where is it coming from? Ultimately, it has to rest on the CEO, I think, right? Like when there is an incident that has the attention of Lorenzo and me, it comes down to who's running the show there.
Well, I do want the audience to be aware that you have different purposes sometimes in publishing your articles. So TechCrunch and the Wall Street Journal are not the same in terms of what you publish and the timing of that, correct? Lorenzo, do you want to share maybe what time frame you're on, what kinds of articles you publish, how quickly you publish?
I'm just saying, you're making it sound like I don't want to scoop Lorenzo, which is definitely not true.
Well, you do want to scoop Lorenzo.
All the time, but you're right. You're absolutely right. We kind of operate at different ways.
Yeah. I also don't want to be scooped by you, by the way. So yeah, I mean, we are, my day-to-day is cybersecurity. Zach Whitaker, my editor, also cybersecurity day in, day out. Carly Page, my other colleague, also as well. So, there is a little bit of pressure that mostly we put on ourselves to, get stories, inform the public, inform the victims themselves, because when companies get hacked, it's not just the company that gets hacked. It's their customers, their employees, people that have no blame in any of this. And so, as I said earlier, we try to be fast, but we want to be accurate first. We don't want to publish anything wrong. We don't want to alarm maybe the victims, the customers of this big corporation that are worried that maybe their social security numbers have been stolen, or their text messages or things like that. So I think there's we also need to think about the people sort of downstream that get affected by a breach. Sometimes I do get, after the story gets published, people saying, I was hacked, can you help me contact the company to...
So Lorenzo, do you think that having those eyes on this information, publishing the story, do you think that can hurt either the company that got hacked or maybe the data subjects themselves, just having that extra attention?
I mean, I think transparency is almost...
We're in a safe space.
Yeah, I think transparency always helps. As I was saying, sometimes I get customers that sort of like our downstream, right? Big companies been hacked, their personal information has been potentially leaked, and they reached out to me saying, can you help me contact the company? Like, is my data affected? And I say, I'm sorry, but like, I don't know. I myself don't know. And I wish I could help you. But that's where I think the frustration comes, and I understand maybe the investigation is not finished. But maybe, again, there's a middle ground. Maybe you can say, I'm investigating. We believe that some of this information may be hacked. But I don't know, there's like the United Health breach, for example, from this year has been pretty frustrating because the company has yet to say how many people have been affected. And we're talking about the biggest healthcare company in the US.
And why do you think they haven't said that?
It's hard to tell. I mean, if they still don't know, that's pretty concerning. It's been months, and we're talking about healthcare, health data. Yeah.
Wait, you have the answer?
I have. Well, here's the thing: is when you're dealing with, and I think it's not recognized in the breach notification laws either. Like back in the day, breaches were a lot easier when you just have one business, they have their data, figure out it's small files, and figure out who's been impacted and give notice. When it comes to service provider breaches, you're talking about a lot of volume of data, a lot of complexity of data, and how the data is stored too, and that the way that breach notification laws are structured, service providers only have an obligation to notify the data owner, and the data owner then has to go out and notify the consumers. But some of the complications that come up in incidents like this is, imagine a service provider that maintains data on thousands of organizations, and let's say my data is in 40 different customers' databases. We need to think through the process of, should I get 40 different breach notifications, which makes it seem like to a consumer, my information has been breached 40 times? Or does there need to be a dialogue between these customers and the service providers? Just coordinating the logistics around notifications has become increasingly complex because of how reliant we are on service providers and technology these days. So I think that it's not, and truthfully, I'll talk about the Blackbaud matter just briefly. That was the case that actually Troutman was representing, and coming out of that case,
Blackbaud was a cloud provider, by the way, that got hacked by cyber extortionists, and there's concern that their customer information as well was leaked. So just to give the audience that background.
Yeah, and so they maintain data on behalf of hundreds, thousands of organizations, and it came out in the end that there was actually no feasible way because the customers controlled what data they were putting in, and it was very customizable within their 20 different SaaS solutions. It was a very complex issue that not even plaintiffs' experts could have figured out. So just to say, there's a lot of complexities that I think people don't appreciate. It's like flip a switch and say, tell us whose data, what's involved, but you need to understand that it's complex environments and we're dealing with a lot of different organizations' data. But Sherri, I wanted to talk one thing. I think you said one thing that your objective is being fast but accurate. We have something in common now. We want to be fast but accurate, but again, we need to be accurate with respect to the full scope, not with respect to a smaller storyline. And the other thing that came up is, one thing, sometimes when information does get leaked to the media, it's not the worst thing in the world to us, because from a negotiation standpoint, then I'm going to go back to a threat actor and say, well, you've just lost your leverage, right? So if you're going to go out and leak to the media, then okay, great. And so we kind of keep that in our back pocket too. And ultimately, one thing to keep in mind is, if a threat actor does or does not leak to the media, or if you pay or not pay, it does not change your obligation to notify. That has no impact on whether or not you have to notify from a breach notification perspective.
I see Bob smiling, and I'm curious why.
I just think about Uber,
Well, okay, and that's a whole different session.
Go on.
A whole different session. Yeah.
Share with the audience.
I mean, so is it a breach, right? Like, I think there is some playing that companies do around this, right? And Uber is the canonical example, because they had a breach, and then they chose to treat it as a security disclosure. And that was, I think it was very unfair to their customers. You looked at it, it clearly was a breach. And they are the rare example of a company that paid a consequence for that. But I think, again, like I don't think all companies act with the same sort of level risk evaluation around these things. So you have sort of a spectrum of things, and there's some companies that are on the spectrum of like, yeah, it's a research, yeah, we'll just pay to make it go away. That need to be held accountable.
Yeah, well, and I think you can see that when cloud providers get hacked by like Blackbaud, because only a subset of those customers appear to be actually investigating properly. I'm guessing we can all agree, like, not every customer of a cloud provider is going to go through a proper data breach investigation. But I'm curious, so it sounds like we all have something in common. We want to get the story out fast. We want it to be accurate, except you want to be faster than you want to be faster than you, and you want them to slow down until you're ready, right?
I want them to not pay attention to what's going on here.
All right, I'm glad we're being honest here. But tell me about, speaking of accurate, tell me about your verification process. And Bob, I haven't heard from you about how your articles are different from TechCrunch, and I'd love to know how you verify and how you verify.
I don't think it's any different, really. I think he's just better at it, you know. Because he does it a lot, and so we're like, yeah, is the data, are the claims accurate? Like we do. One thing that might be a little different is that at the Journal we practice something called no surprise journalism. So we basically, if we're going to write about you, we're not going to surprise you. There's not going to be an article that shows up that like says something about you that you haven't had a fair chance to comment on, and so that can sometimes slow things down a little bit because we call you up, we're like, we understand there's been a data breach, and you might be hearing about it for the first time from us, and so what's an appropriate amount of time to give you in order to respond? So the clock starts, with that first call, but it can, like we're not going to with the data breach, we're not going to call you, inform you of it for the first time, and have a story out like 5 minutes later.
And how do you know who to contact? Like, is contact an issue?
No, I mean, the companies we deal with have, they have media. They have, it's not. We're good at finding out who we need to call and calling them.
You investigate, but Sadia seems to disagree.
Well, so we have some clients that get some employee gets an email, a LinkedIn message from a security researcher saying, hey, it just gets communicated to someone in the organization who does not know what to do with it. Or it's in an inbox to belong to an employee that's no longer at the organization. And they get an automated reply. And so I see that as being a potential issue about who to. It's not going to be an issue for larger organizations that have dedicated media contacts, but sometimes it goes to.
We're going to try really hard. We're not going to just send like a general email address. We're going to find the phone number of the CEO or reach start calling everybody we can, and
so you're not going to go out with the story until you hear from the victim.
We have a good understanding that they've got the message, because some companies will then just go radio silent on you, right? And you're like, okay, I know I've reached somebody and they're not getting back to me, and that gets frustrating. But so at a certain point, we'll run the story, but we will be certain that they've had a chance to.
Right, and you'll put in that snarky little comment that says like they cannot be reached for comment or something like that.
Yeah. That's not, you don't want that in the story.
Yeah, no. Lorenzo, how about you? Tell me about your process.
I mean, I think it's very similar. If I can share one frustration, I think one of the things that I hate the most is companies that have contact forms rather than email addresses.
Oh.
I find those, I don't trust any of those forms. Like, I don't know if that email has actually been sent. It's one of the worst things you can do. Just, create an email inbox, call it press, PR, media, whatever you want, but please do not do contact forms. But I agree with Bob. I think we do want to have a certain, a certain certainty that we have reached the right people. And sometimes it could be that the company responds saying, "We received your email. We're looking into it," and that's great. Like, I feel better about everything.
Okay.
Pet peeve is like those media contacts that don't have contact information. Like, they list their press people, but you don't.
Yeah, also terrible.
We don't want spam.
There's like the office address, the names, and I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to show up to the office.
But now you will publish the article if you don't hear from the victim, correct?
Yeah, well, it depends. If there's been enough time for us, enough time for the victim to have responded, which varies by the circumstances of the story and the breach. And if we have some other indication that the breach actually happened. Because again, both with cyber criminals and maybe less so with nation-state hackers, well, you cannot trust any of them, obviously. You know, we need to verify, we need to have a certain confidence that something happened. And you know, maybe the first story is something happened, and we transparently say we don't know what happened exactly.
But you still broke the story.
Well, it's not just so much about beating other people. It's just that, you know, the customers, the consumers have a right to know that their phone numbers maybe are out there, their social security numbers are out there, or their healthcare data is out there.
Now, you were telling me earlier you got an uncomfortable email from a hacker. Can you tell us about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was a chat message, and I think it was after we wrote the story about the recent Twilio breach, which where essentially hackers were able to download a list of phone numbers of people who use Authy, the two-factor authentication app owned by Twilio. And this hacker, a couple of weeks later, said, hey, I have another breach. You know, I heard that you do PR for hackers or something like that. It was an expression that I was like, I don't do that, and I don't like how, you know, I don't like your tone. So, you know, I think when that happens, I'm extra careful. I'm like, okay, this person is clearly interested in getting their message out.
Right.
And sometimes it's because those people are trying to sell the data online. You know, they're not just trying to maybe get a ransom, but they go on breach forums or any of those kind of forums that are trying to like monetize the data in any way. You know, they hope that other hackers buy it.
Well, they do, and they present sometimes like they're on your side, right? Like, you know, this company is not responding, and you know, we know what's really going on, and we'll help you with your story and stuff like that. And it's
I've seen that as a
icky.
ransomware negotiator, where sometimes the criminals will say, "Hey, it's us versus the victim."
Yeah,
and that's not the way it works. Hopefully. But Sadia, what are your thoughts? So we've made some progress here, I think. So not having contact forms, having real email addresses, good standard to set, responding and just saying like, we're working on it. I think that's something we talked about ahead of time. What else are you thinking?
Yeah, I guess that I want to be clear that I also agree. I want companies I represent to be transparent and forthcoming. I just want them to think about and be factual, right? That's really important. Is you be as transparent as you can. Be forthcoming, because I think then you have a better story to tell in the end, because I don't think it helps anyone when you just aren't communicating. Sherri, you've heard me say it before that I think one of the most important things when it comes to incident response is your communication strategy. Like, you could have the greatest technical response in the world, but if you can't get your communications right, you're going to fall flat, and it's going to affect your brand and your reputation. And so I am a huge advocate for being transparent and forthcoming. But also, if you're going to be transparent and forthcoming, you need to think about the follow-up. Think about the next question your customer or the regulator or consumer is going to ask, and do you have answers to that question? A very easy example is, if a customer gets wind of an incident, they immediately want a root cause analysis, or we're shutting off our connections to you until you can provide that, even if it has no impact on them whatsoever. And so that is something you just need to think about, that we're not going to have a root cause analysis for you tomorrow signed by the forensic firm to hand over. So you just have to be prepared for what that follow-up looks like. It's challenging, but you can get through it.
Sadia, I think that's great. And we're moving into our closing section here, but maybe we could hear one more time from Bob and from Lorenzo. Are there any last thoughts you have on this topic before we wrap? How can we make sure that we are serving the public interest and getting information out without empowering the hackers and making sure that we're accurate?
Well, we were talking about Change Healthcare and like how there could be some problems in coming up with a number, you know? Like, you can communicate that. We're not dumb. Like, we can understand complicated things, like, for example, that it might be difficult to come to a number, and why that would be. Like, that can be part of the discussion. You don't just have to have the number, but like, if you want to engage and kind of explain where you are and why certain things might be a certain way, like, we love that kind of stuff. We love complexity. That's where we add our value as reporters, right? Is navigating the complex.
Yeah, I think the Change Healthcare example is great because the CEO went on, on the Hill to do some hearings, and one of the questions that the senators and then the representatives asked was repeatedly, like, how many people were affected? How many people were affected? And in the morning, the CEO was like, we don't know, we're still looking into it. Then in the afternoon, somebody else asked again, and the CEO said something like, We think it's like a third, something like between a third or more, or 50% of the, I may be forgetting the numbers, but he knew that answer the day before or even like a week before. And as Bob says, like, okay, even if you don't have like, the exact figure, you can say the percentage. That's already interesting for the public interest, and it's good for the consumers to know.
So you want to feel like they trust you, and you want to be able to trust them to give you accurate information when they have it available. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, when in the morning you say, I have no idea how many people were hit, and then in the afternoon says, well, yeah, it was a third of Americans, then
Sure.
That's not great.
Right. Sadia, I think we have just a few seconds left. Any last thoughts?
No, I think that this is right, and we talk about this often as documenting your challenges that you face in an incident response and documenting, okay, why is it so hard to figure out the numbers, and going through and actually writing it down so that you could explain it, because it's going to be a question that comes up later on during an investigation, during any kind of potential litigation, making sure you're tracking all of the issues and the challenges, and also the assumptions that you make during a response are very important, and it goes to your narrative at the end. The goal at the end of the day is to have a defensible response and a good story to tell, right? And so you need to gather all of these facts that come up, the issues and challenges, because it's not a black and white issue. Incident response is not black and white, and there's not always a clear path to follow. But you need to document your challenges, document the assumptions you're making, and think about how those assumptions are going to be viewed from a consumer harm perspective and from a regulator's perspective.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you for letting us turn the tables. I feel like we made some good progress here. Little group hug, everybody. And thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for being such a great moderator.
Thank you.